voter ID laws. Here, I think we're talking about voter ID laws that are really, as Tova said, the Indiana case everyone's talking about, and what I'm going to talk about in my brief remarks, and I think we're all going to talk mostly about, are not just any old voter ID laws. You've had voter ID laws for a long time that says you have to show some kind of ID at the polls. Some kind of ID was often very broad. In Georgia, before the more recent laws, it was 17 different forms of ID that you could show. A utility bill, a bank statement, other things. And then if you didn't have your ID, then you could do what I'll call an affidavit bypass. You could essentially swear under penalty of law that you are who you say you are. And then you could vote, right? So those kind of laws are not shown to be proven. They're typically had been pre-cleared by the Department of Justice as not retrogressive when they were imposed in various states. There was a way, it was not really impinging on the right to vote. The kind of ID laws we're talking about now are those that have a hard requirement for a government-issued photo ID that you have to show or you don't vote. And this whole idea of going to the clerk and then getting permission to go back, I mean, I'm sorry, nobody's going to do that. Particularly people who are on an hourly wage who don't get to have the whole day off to screw around with trying to vote, right? They have to get back to work. No one's doing that. So these are about laws that say if you don't have a government-issued photo ID, you're denied your right to vote fundamentally. And others will talk about what problem this is supposed to cure, and I'll talk a little bit about the impact. So the question we have to ask is, it's kind of the balancing question of what is the seriousness of the problem that others will talk about, and then what's the impact on the fundamental right to vote. And this is all done in the context of the intersection of race, which I hope we don't lose in the conversation. So who do these ID laws like in Georgia and Indiana, fall the hardest on? Well, people who traditionally are facing barriers at the polls. And I'll just have some stats that you all may be very familiar with. But according to the Georgia chapter of AARP, 36% of Georgians over age 75 don't have a driver's license. Have they lost their right to vote? What about African Americans? There was a study that was done in Wisconsin that I actually found on the Heritage Foundation's website, that in Wisconsin, 80% of men and 81% of women had valid driver's licenses. 45% of African American men, 51% of African American women have driver's licenses. That's a huge difference. That's what I call the denial of the right to vote. The Brennan Center did this study. There's not that much data that is that hard and that good around these issues, unfortunately. Brennan Center did a study, a survey, to try and get some better numbers to look at the impact. And they found that 25% of African Americans of voting age have no current government-issued photo ID. I want to stress the word current also. Not your old ID that lapsed, but a current one. And often one that has your current address on it. That makes it valid, right? It's a very small, it's a large percentage of people in these communities that are very much affected. I want to talk a bit about people who are low-income Americans. So low-income Americans much less likely to have a valid government-issued photo ID. Why? I always love this thing about airplanes and federal buildings for two reasons. One, didn't Hurricane Katrina teach us anything about poor people? Poor people don't fly. We're all flying. They're not. They're also not going into federal buildings, and they're not cashing checks. Sorry, folks, but they're not. So they're not. This whole notion that everybody's got it, we've all got it in our pocket, they don't. But they still have the right to vote, don't they? Right? And I also love this thing that says, well, since you have to have an ID to fly in an airplane or go in a federal building, then certainly you should have it to vote, since voting is more important. Whoa. Isn't that the opposite, right? Since voting is more important, shouldn't we protect it more than going into federal buildings and flying on airplanes? Right? Like, shouldn't you still have your right to vote even if we're going to deny you the right to fly? Isn't flying more optional than the right to vote should be? That always gets me. The other thing I'll just say, because I know I'm going on too long, is that ID requirements that have no affidavit bypass also open the door to discrimination in the polling place. We've just gone through this process of reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, where we had 98-0 in the Senate, overwhelming vote in the House. Everybody agrees we still have discrimination in voting. Everybody agrees. Maybe not everybody, but the entire Congress does. What on earth do they all agree on? But they all agree on that. So does President Bush sign the bill? So we know we still have a problem, but yet voter ID laws present a lot of opportunity for discretion in the polling place. Because typically you're going to ask ID of people who? Who? It offers a wide range of discretion of who to ask ID of and whether that ID is going to meet your requirements. Is it valid enough? And in an atmosphere where we know race-based discrimination is still going on, that's going to fall more heavily on minority populations. And to a large extent, the last thing I will say is this notion of citizenship. The Real ID, which you all may know about, this law that was passed, would require that you have an ID card that proves your citizenship when you vote. Okay, if you're, well, the whole idea of this sort of stopping undocumented people from voting. I mean, if you're undocumented, are you voting? You're going to go into a polling booth where they have government officials? If you're undocumented, trust me, you're not voting. You're looking to stay out of the limelight. You don't want people asking a lot of, I mean, you're there, you know, you're not looking to get caught, typically. But what this law would do is it would make a requirement on all of us that we have proof of citizenship when we vote. Who right now sitting here has their passport in their pocket? Okay, she can vote and so can you. Nobody else can if the polling place were right here, right now. What percentage of Americans have passports? Different estimates, somewhere around 25%. Any other document you have that proves your citizenship? Anybody? If you were naturalized after 2001, I think you have something. If you were naturalized after 2001, I think you have a document with your picture on it that says you're a citizen. The rest of you don't. This is about the right to vote.